Tonight, we leave behind the soft comforts of modern life and quietly step into the cold, stone silence of ancient Sparta, a land where boys were forged into warriors and discipline was not a choice but a lifelong rhythm. No feasts, no luxury, only shields, sandals, and silence beneath the stars. What was it really like to live, train, and sleep as a Spartan? What secrets did they whisper in the barracks? And what happened when the armor came off and the night was too still? This is not a story of glory. It's a tale of quiet strength, of aching feet, and the sound of spears resting by moonlight. Before we march into the long shadows of Laconia, take a peaceful moment to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss our next sleepy tale from history's forgotten corners. In the comments below, tell us, would you survive a single night in a Spartan Agog barrack or sneak away into the hills? Your answer just might decide the story we lull you to sleep with next. In the pre-dawn darkness of a Spartan morning, you would find yourself shivering slightly despite the Mediterranean warmth that would soon envelop the valley of the Eurotas River. The Spartan warrior, already awake before the sun's first rays painted the Taygetus mountains in purple and gold, began his day not with prayer or meditation, but with the practical business of survival. His breakfast was not a moment of comfort or family gathering, as you might expect from other Greek city-states where citizens reclined on couches to discuss philosophy over honeyed wine. Instead, he made his way through narrow streets of austere stone buildings toward the communal dining hall known as the Syssitia, where the infamous black broth awaited him. This black broth, called melasomos by the Spartans themselves, represented everything that set these warriors apart from their fellow Greeks. Imagine a thick, dark liquid that looked more like the contents of a blacksmith's quenching trough than something meant to sustain human life. The broth was prepared from pork meat and blood, seasoned only with salt and vinegar, creating a taste so bitter and unpalatable that foreign visitors would sometimes retch at their first spoonful. The Spartan warrior, however, consumed it without expression, knowing that this meal was not designed for pleasure, but for purpose. The broth provided iron from the blood, protein from the meat, and the vinegar helped preserve it while aiding digestion. More importantly, it served as a daily reminder that comfort and luxury had no place in the life of a Spartan citizen. The dining hall itself buzzed with the quiet efficiency of men who had performed this ritual thousands of times before. You would notice immediately the absence of decoration, the plain wooden tables, the rough-hewn benches that encouraged good posture rather than relaxation. Each man contributed his monthly share to the communal mess from his state-allotted farm worked by helots, the subjugated population that formed the economic backbone of Spartan society. The warrior might bring barley, cheese, wine, or occasionally figs, but these delicacies were distributed equally among the 15 members of his dining group. The black broth, however, remained constant, a daily baptism into the Spartan way of life that began in boyhood and continued until the age of 60, when a warrior could finally retire from military service. As you watched these men eat their humble meal in silence, you might wonder how such a system came to be. The answer lies in the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, who established these communal dining halls as part of his comprehensive reform of Spartan society in the 8th century BCE. Lycurgus understood something fundamental about human nature that modern nutritionists have only recently rediscovered: the power of ritual in shaping behavior. By making the same simple meal a daily requirement for every citizen, regardless of their social status or wealth, he eliminated the natural human tendency toward dietary excess and the social stratification that comes from elaborate feasting. The black broth was democratic in its own harsh way, ensuring that no Spartan could become soft through indulgence or distinguish himself through culinary sophistication. The warrior's morning routine extended beyond mere sustenance. After the black broth had been consumed, and the simple accompaniments of barley cake and perhaps a small piece of cheese had been shared, the real business of the day began. The men would discuss military matters, political decisions that needed to be made, and any reports of helot activity that required attention. This was not idle chatter, but the serious business of maintaining a society entirely organized around military effectiveness. You might find yourself puzzled by the apparent contradiction between the Spartan reputation for taciturnity, their very name giving us the word laconic for someone who speaks few words in these seemingly endless morning discussions. The resolution of this apparent paradox lies in understanding that Spartans spoke little in the presence of outsiders or about matters they considered trivial, but among themselves, in their own mess halls, communication was essential for the survival of their unique society. The morning meal concluded with the youngest member of each mess carrying away the simple wooden bowls and spoons washed in cold water from the nearby spring. No spices lingered in the air, no aroma of roasting meat or baking bread would make passers-by envious. Just the faint metallic scent of iron from the blood broth and the practical efficiency of men who had eaten not for pleasure, but for the strength to fulfill their duty to Sparta. As you walked away from the Syssitia, you might find yourself wondering what drove these men to accept such an austere existence when other Greek city-states offered their citizens the pleasures of wine, women's song, and material wealth. The answer would become clearer as the day progressed, and you witnessed the next phase of Spartan life. But already you could sense that something deeper than mere discipline held this society together. To understand how a human being could voluntarily embrace the Spartan lifestyle, you must travel back in time to witness the transformation of a 7-year-old boy as he enters the agog, the legendary training system that would define the next 23 years of his life. Picture a child torn from his mother's arms, not literally but effectively, as he is inducted into what amounted to a state-run military academy that made no distinction between education and indoctrination. The boy would not see his family again except for brief, supervised visits during religious festivals, and even these encounters would be carefully structured to ensure that his primary loyalty remained with his training group rather than his biological relations. The first morning of the agog began before dawn, just like every morning that would follow for the next 2 decades. The boy would find himself assigned to a group of peers his age, perhaps 15 boys who would become closer than brothers through shared hardship. Their supervisor, a paidonomos or boy herder, was typically a man in his 30s who had already proven himself in battle and demonstrated the emotional hardness required for this difficult duty. Unlike modern educators who might encourage creativity and self-expression, the paidonomos had one singular goal: to prepare these boys for the physical and psychological demands of Spartan warrior life. The transformation began immediately with the mundane yet symbolic act of having their heads shaved completely, a practice that would continue throughout their training. Years to eliminate any vanity associated with personal appearance. The physical training that followed seemed almost designed to push human endurance to its breaking point. You might imagine military drills or weapons practice, but the reality was far more basic and brutal. The boys were deliberately underfed, receiving barely enough nutrition to sustain growth, forcing them to develop cunning and resourcefulness to survive. They learned to steal food from local farms and household stores, but this was not petty theft, it was state-sanctioned training in the arts of stealth and survival. The crucial detail that reveals the true nature of this system lies in the punishment for theft, not for the act itself, but only for being caught in the act. A boy who successfully stole a chicken and consumed it without detection had demonstrated exactly the skills Sparta valued. One who was caught during the theft would be severely beaten, not for taking the chicken, but for his incompetence in doing so. The curriculum extended beyond mere survival skills to include all the elements that would make these boys effective warriors. They learned to read and write, but only enough to fulfill military communications. Their education in literature focused on memorizing war hymns and the martial poetry of Tyrtaeus, whose verses celebrated death in battle as the highest achievement possible for a Spartan. Physical training included running, jumping, throwing the discus and javelin, boxing and wrestling, all the standard events of Greek athletic competition, but practiced not for glory or prize money, but purely for military utility. The boys ran barefoot across rocky terrain to develop calloused feet that would never blister during long marches. They learned to dance not for cultural enrichment, but because rhythmic movement in formation was essential for the phalanx, tactics that defined Greek warfare. Perhaps most challenging for modern understanding was the psychological conditioning that accompanied physical training. The boys were organized into competitive groups where individual achievement was meaningless and only collective success mattered. They slept together on beds they constructed themselves from river reeds, learning that even basic comfort was something to be earned through effort rather than provided as a right. Their clothing consisted of a single rough cloak regardless of weather, teaching them to endure discomfort without complaint. Most significantly, they were encouraged to form close emotional bonds with older boys and young men, relationships that modern observers might find troubling, but which served a specific purpose in creating the intense unit cohesion necessary for phalanx warfare. The agoge also included what might be called practical education in the darker aspects of Spartan society. Older boys participated in the crypteia, effectively a secret police force that operated at night to terrify the helot population. This was not simply random violence, but a calculated system of psychological warfare designed to maintain Spartan dominance over a population that vastly outnumbered their masters. A boy who participated in these nighttime raids learned to move silently through the countryside, to select targets strategically, and to use terror as a tool of state policy. These experiences served double duty. They maintained helot subjugation while hardening the young Spartans against the emotional impact of violence. By the time a boy reached his late teens, his transformation was already remarkable to outside observers. The soft features of childhood had been replaced by the lean, muscular physique of someone who had never known excess. His feet were as tough as leather from years of barefoot training. His ability to endure hunger, cold, and physical discomfort would have seemed superhuman to other Greeks who might have interpreted his stoicism as lacking in human feeling. In reality, the Spartan youth had simply learned to compartmentalize his physical needs, to derive satisfaction from the approval of his peers and instructors rather than from creature comforts. The ultimate test of this conditioning came at age 18, when he had to literally fight his way into one of the competitive mess groups that would define his adult social life. The culmination of the agoge came not with graduation, but with election to a syssitia, the communal dining group that would become his primary social unit for the rest of his life. This election process was brutally democratic. A single negative vote from any existing member of the 15-man group was sufficient to reject a candidate. The implications of rejection were devastating, as failure to gain admission to any mess meant exclusion from Spartan citizenship itself. You might wonder what qualities these young men sought in their dining companions, since military prowess was assumed to be nearly equal among all candidates. The answer lies in the psychological conditioning that had been taking place for over a decade, the ability to endure hardship without complaint, to contribute to group success without seeking individual recognition, and most importantly, to display absolute loyalty to one's comrades over any other consideration, including family ties. The ultimate test of Spartan loyalty did not occur on any battlefield, but in the quiet moments when individual desires clashed with collective obligation. Consider the case of a Spartan warrior who had successfully completed his agoge training, been accepted into a prestigious mess, and married according to the peculiar customs that governed Spartan domestic life. His wife had been chosen for him by his family and hers with the explicit purpose of producing strong children who would continue the Spartan military tradition. The couple's interactions were limited and structured. Their first meeting occurred when he kidnapped her in a ceremonial ritual. She wore her hair shorn like a boy's head, and their initial sexual encounters were conducted secretly and with minimal emotional connection. This was not romance as understood in other Greek city-states, but a practical arrangement designed to maintain the population of warrior citizens. The warrior's daily life was entirely consumed by military duties that began before dawn and continued until evening. He trained with his unit, maintained his equipment, participated in the Syssitia meals, and performed whatever guard duties or patrols were assigned to him. His farm, worked by helot laborers, provided the necessary contributions to his mess, but required no personal attention beyond periodic inspections to ensure the workers remained productive and submissive. This left him with no personal time, no hobbies or recreational pursuits, no opportunity to develop interests outside his military role. The psychological pressure of this existence was enormous, yet the Agog training had specifically prepared him for this reality by eliminating the capacity to imagine alternative ways of living. The first real test of his loyalty came when he discovered that his wife had been unfaithful during one of his extended military campaigns. In other Greek city-states, such infidelity might result in divorce, public scandal, or even violence, but the Spartan response was governed by an entirely different set of priorities. The warrior was expected to understand that his wife's sexual activity was her own business, provided it did not interfere with her primary duty of bearing strong children. If she became pregnant by another man, the child would still be raised as a Spartan citizen, since the emphasis was on the physical quality of the offspring rather than strict paternity. This expectation required the warrior to suppress personal jealousy and sexual possessiveness emotions that the Agog had trained him to view as weaknesses incompatible with military discipline. A more severe test occurred when the warrior's mess group was assigned to participate in the Cryptire operations against the Helots. These nighttime missions sometimes required the assassination of Helots who had demonstrated unusual intelligence, physical prowess, or leadership qualities that might inspire rebellion. The warrior might find himself ordered to kill a Helot with whom he had developed a working relationship, someone who had managed his farm efficiently or provided valuable information about other Helots' activities. The Agog training had specifically prepared him for this moment by teaching him to view Helots not as human beings, but as tools of the state, to be maintained when useful and eliminated when potentially dangerous. Yet the act of killing someone he knew personally, even if that person was legally a slave, tested the psychological conditioning in ways that pure physical hardship never could. The ultimate loyalty test came when the warrior was required to choose between his mess group and his own family. This was not a theoretical dilemma, but a practical reality that arose when family obligations conflicted with military duties. A Spartan might receive news that his father was dying, his wife was seriously ill, or his child required his presence for some important ceremony. The Agogi had specifically conditioned him to view such family concerns as secondary to his obligations to his mess and to Sparta itself. Missing a Syssitia meal for family reasons would result in immediate expulsion from the group, effectively ending his life as a Spartan citizen. The warrior learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to fulfill his family role only when it did not interfere with his military obligations, and to find satisfaction in the knowledge that his sacrifice served a greater purpose. The psychological cost of this loyalty system became apparent in the quiet moments when warriors displayed what might be called human emotion despite their training. They took great pride in their children's physical development, teaching them basic military skills even before they entered the Agog. They formed intense bonds with their messmates that often exceeded the emotional connections to their biological families. They developed a dark sense of humor about their austere lifestyle, joking about the black broth and their rough sleeping arrangements in ways that would have seemed bizarre to outsiders. These small human touches did not represent failures of the agog system, but rather adaptations that allowed men to survive psychologically while maintaining their military effectiveness. The true test of Spartan loyalty ultimately came not in individual moments of crisis, but in the slow accumulation of daily choices that reinforced their identity as warriors above all other roles. A Spartan who lived to the age of 60 and retired from military service might look back on a life completely defined by his participation in the agog, his mess group membership, and his military campaigns. He might have fathered children, owned property, and participated in political assemblies, but these were secondary activities that filled the gaps between his primary identity as a warrior. The agog had succeeded in creating men who found their greatest satisfaction not in individual achievement, but in knowing they had fulfilled their role as components of the Spartan military machine. They had learned to submerge their individual desires, emotions, and ambitions in service to a collective identity that demanded absolute loyalty and provided, in return, the deep satisfaction of belonging to something larger than themselves. As you consider the life of a Spartan warrior, you might find yourself both admiring and recoiling from the completeness of his transformation. The agogi system had taken human children and shaped them into something remarkable warriors whose discipline, courage, and loyalty were legendary throughout the ancient world. Yet, this transformation came at an enormous cost: the elimination of most of what we consider essential to human happiness: personal choice, emotional expression, family intimacy, intellectual curiosity, and creative expression. The Spartan warrior represented the ultimate triumph of nurture over nature, proof that human beings could be trained to overcome their natural inclinations in service to a collective ideal. But as you drift off to sleep, you might wonder whether such a complete transformation represents the highest achievement of human potential or the most profound form of personal loss. The morning mist clung to the valley of Sparta as the bronze workshops began their daily production, but the sound you heard was not the casual conversation of artisans found in other Greek city-states. Instead, it was the purposeful rhythm of hammers on metal, the controlled breathing of bellows, and the methodical filing of edges that would determine whether a warrior lived or died in his next battle. The Spartan armorer worked with the same dedication that characterized every aspect of this militarized society, knowing that his craft was not artistic expression, but life-saving precision. Each piece of bronze armor had to meet exacting specifications, not for beauty, but for the perfect balance between protection and mobility that would allow a hoplite to function effectively in the crushing press of phalanx warfare. The process began with the selection of raw bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that had to maintain specific proportions to achieve the optimal combination of hardness and flexibility. The Spartan metalworker understood these proportions not through formal chemical education, which would have been deemed unnecessary luxury, but through generations of trial and error that had established the perfect recipe for military equipment. He would heat the metal in furnaces fed by charcoal made from the local forests, maintaining temperatures that could only be judged by eye and experience, until the bronze glowed with the particular orange-red color that indicated it was ready for forging. The quality control in this process was absolute. Failure to produce armor that met Spartan standards could result in severe punishment, since defective equipment directly threatened military effectiveness. The centerpiece of the Spartan hoplite's equipment was the hoplon shield, a massive circular disc approximately 3 feet in diameter that weighed between 15 and 20 pounds. Unlike modern depictions that often show Spartans with smaller, more manageable shields, the historical hoplon was specifically designed for the close quarters fighting of the phalanx formation. The construction process began with a solid wooden core, typically made from hardwoods like oak or maple that could withstand tremendous impact without splitting. This core was then covered with thin bronze sheeting that provided additional protection while adding crucial weight that helped stabilize the shield when braced against the ground or an opponent's attack. The rim was reinforced with a bronze facing that could be used offensively to strike an enemy's face or arms during the chaos of battle. The psychological impact of carrying this shield daily cannot be overstated. From the age of 18, Spartan warriors drilled with their hoplon in all weather conditions, developing the specific muscle groups required to maneuver this substantial piece of equipment effectively. The shield was held using a unique grip system called the argive grip, which positioned the warrior's forearm along a central bronze spine while his hand grasped a leather loop at the rim. This arrangement allowed the shield to be supported primarily by the larger muscles of the upper arm and shoulder rather than just the hand and wrist. Crucial for maintaining defensive posture during extended combat, the warrior learned to angle the shield precisely to deflect rather than simply absorb enemy blows, a technique that required years of practice to master. The breastplate or thorax presented an entirely different set of engineering challenges. Unlike the simple leather or cloth armor worn by warriors in other cultures, the Spartan hoplite's bronze breastplate had to provide protection to the torso while allowing the full range of motion necessary for phalanx tactics. The design typically included a front and back plate joined by hinges at the shoulders and sides, creating a flexible system that could absorb the impact of enemy weapons while permitting the warrior to lean into his shield, thrust with his spear, and maintain formation integrity. The bronze had to be thick enough to stop or deflect enemy spear points and arrowheads, yet thin enough to keep overall weight manageable for long campaigns. The greaves or nemides that protected the warrior's lower legs represented perhaps the most refined example of Spartan metalworking skill. These pieces had to fit the individual warrior's legs precisely, since any shifting or rattling during movement could compromise formation discipline and reveal fatigue to enemy observers. The greaves were crafted from a single piece of bronze that was carefully shaped to follow the contours of the shin and calf muscles, with the top edge flaring outwards slightly to prevent chafing during long marches. The metal retained enough spring tension to grip the leg securely without straps, yet could be removed quickly if the warrior needed to swim or tend to wounds. This combination of secure fit and easy removal required the armorer to develop an intuitive understanding of human anatomy and metal properties that modern engineers might find remarkable. The helmet or cuirass represented the most technically challenging piece of hoplite equipment, requiring the armorer to balance visibility, hearing, ventilation, and protection in a single bronze casting. The Corinthian style favored by Spartans enveloped the entire head with only narrow eye slits and minimal openings for breathing and hearing, creating what was essentially a bronze fortress around the warrior's most vulnerable area. The interior had to be padded with felt or leather to prevent the metal from cutting into the skin during combat. But this padding could not be so thick as to interfere with hearing commands or cause overheating during extended fighting. The helmet's distinctive horsehair crest served not merely as decoration, but as a crucial identification system that allowed warriors to distinguish friends from enemies in the dust and chaos of battle, while also making the wearer appear taller and more intimidating to opponents. The spear or doru that completed the hoplite's equipment was itself a masterpiece of practical engineering. Measuring between 8 and 10 feet in length, it had to be long enough to project beyond the front rank of the phalanx while remaining manageable for individual combat. The shaft was typically made from ash wood, selected for its combination of strength and flexibility, and tapered gradually from the grip section to the tip to optimize balance. The iron spearhead was designed to penetrate armor effectively while being robust enough to withstand the impact of striking shields and bronze breastplates without breaking or bending permanently. The butt spike or solitaire, usually made of bronze, served multiple purposes. It balanced the weapon for throwing, could be used as a secondary weapon if the main point broke, and provided a deadly downward strike against fallen enemies. What made Spartan armor production unique was the complete integration of manufacturing with military training and social organization. Unlike Athens, where armorers might produce equipment for export or civilian use, Spartan workshops focused exclusively on military production according to state specifications. The warrior who received his equipment understood that its quality reflected not just the skill of individual artisans, but the commitment of Spartan society to maintaining military superiority. Every dent in a shield, every scratch on a breastplate, every broken spear shaft was evaluated not as damage, but as information that could be used to improve future equipment. This feedback loop between battlefield experience and manufacturing refinement created a continuous improvement process that helped Sparta maintain its military edge despite having a relatively small population of citizens. The weight of all this equipment, approximately 70 pounds of bronze, wood, and iron, created physical demands that shaped every aspect of Spartan training. Warriors learned to fight effectively while carrying this burden, developing the specific strength and endurance necessary for the particular style of warfare that defined their culture. The equipment was not merely tools of war, but extensions of the warrior's body, so familiar that he could maintain formation, change direction, and execute complex maneuvers without conscious thought about the weight he carried. This physical conditioning was so thorough that Spartan warriors could reportedly continue fighting effectively, even after their equipment had been damaged or partially lost, using their bare hands or pieces of broken weapons with the same effectiveness as their intact armament. As you consider the Spartan approach to military equipment, you might find yourself appreciating the methodical precision that characterized their entire society. While other Greek city-states might equip their hoplites with similar basic equipment, only Sparta integrated armor production so completely with military training and social organization. The bronze machine that was the fully equipped Spartan warrior represented not individual display but collective efficiency, a standardized approach to warfare that maximized the effectiveness of every citizen soldier. Yet this standardization came with inherent limitations. The very uniformity that made Spartans so formidable in phalanx combat also made them less adaptable to changing battlefield conditions or enemy tactics that fell outside their training experience. The perfection of bronze equipment that made them masters of traditional hoplite warfare would eventually contribute to their inability to adapt when warfare itself began to evolve beyond the phalanx system they had perfected. The forge that produced Spartan weapons operated according to rhythms older than memory, patterns of heating and cooling, hammering and resting that had been refined over generations of trial and blood. The armorer's apprentice learned these patterns not through formal instruction, but through observation and repetition, developing an intuitive sense for the precise moment when a spearhead had been shaped to its optimal form. The steel, or more accurately, the iron and bronze that comprised Spartan weapons, had to meet specifications that went beyond mere functionality. Each weapon was designed for a specific tactical purpose within the complex choreography of phalanx warfare, where individual movements were subordinated to collective effectiveness in ways that modern military planners might find both elegant and terrifying. This spear or doru occupied the central role in Spartan tactical doctrine, primarily because it enabled the peculiar style of warfare that had made Sparta famous throughout the Greek world. The formation fighting of the phalanx required weapons that could project beyond the front rank, while maintaining structural integrity during the pushing and thrusting that characterized hoplite combat. The Spartan spear was not designed for individual heroics or dramatic single combat, but for the steady, rhythmic application of force that could break enemy formations through sustained pressure rather than sudden breakthroughs. The warrior learned to hold his spear not in the familiar overhand throwing position depicted in popular culture, but in an underhand grip that allowed him to thrust repeatedly over his shield rim while maintaining the close formation that made the phalanx so difficult to break. The forging process for Spartan spearheads followed procedures that had been established through centuries of battlefield experience. The iron had to be heated to specific temperatures that could only be judged by the color of the glowing metal and the appearance of sparks when struck. Too much heat would make the metal brittle, while insufficient heat would prevent proper shaping and leave the finished product too soft to penetrate enemy armor effectively. The armorer developed calloused hands that could judge temperature through touch, learning to withdraw the metal from the forge at precisely the right moment when it glowed with the particular orange-red color that indicated optimal working temperature. The shaping process involved repeated heating and hammering, with each blow serving to align the metal's crystalline structure in ways that maximize strength while minimizing weight. The sword or xiphos that served as a secondary weapon presented entirely different metallurgical challenges. Unlike the spear, which could be braced against the ground or used with both hands for additional power, the sword had to be wielded with one hand while the other maintained control of the heavy hoplon shield. This required a blade that combined cutting ability with thrusting precision, all while being short enough to maneuver effectively in the close quarters of broken phalanx fighting. The typical Spartan xiphos measured only 18 to 24 inches in length, significantly shorter than the weapons favored by other Greek warriors, reflecting the Spartan preference for extreme close combat where the weight of armor and shield provided decisive advantages. The bronze working techniques used for armor production also applied to weapon manufacturing, but with crucial distinctions that reflected the different mechanical demands placed on offensive versus defensive equipment. Bronze weapons required a careful balance between hardness, which allowed them to maintain sharp edges and retain their shape during combat, and flexibility, which prevented them from shattering under impact. The armorer learned to judge this balance through sound, the particular ring produced when a completed spearhead was struck lightly against an anvil, the way a sword blade vibrated when held loosely and snapped, the particular resistance offered when a file was drawn across a cutting edge. These sensory tests were more reliable than visual inspection, since the critical properties of tempered bronze could not be evaluated accurately through appearance alone. The integration of weapon production with military training created a feedback system that continuously refined Spartan armament based on battlefield experience. Warriors returning from campaigns brought detailed reports about how their equipment had performed under actual combat conditions, not the stylized athletic competitions that other Greeks might mistake for military preparation, but the brutal reality of phalanx fighting where weapons failed, shields splintered, and minor design flaws could result in death. The Spartan military command maintained careful records of these performance reports, using them to adjust manufacturing specifications in ways that gradually improved equipment effectiveness over time. This systematic approach to military technology represented a unique aspect of Spartan society, where every element of social organization was subordinated to military effectiveness. The rhythm of weapon production extended beyond the forge to encompass the entire system of military supply that supported Spartan campaigns. Unlike other Greek city-states that might equip their soldiers based on individual wealth or family resources, Sparta maintained centralized armories that distributed standardized equipment according to strict accounting procedures. Each warrior received his basic kit spear, sword, shield, helmet, breastplate, and greaves at state expense, with replacement parts provided according to standardized schedules based on campaign duration and expected wear. This system eliminated the natural human tendency to hoard or misuse valuable equipment, since warriors understood that damaged or lost items would be replaced without personal cost, but proper maintenance was expected as a matter of military discipline. The psychological impact of carrying standardized weapons created effects that extended far beyond mere practical considerations. When every warrior in a formation carried identical equipment, individual performance became subordinated to collective effectiveness, in ways that enhanced unit cohesion and tactical reliability. A Spartan warrior could predict exactly how his neighbor's spear would perform, how much space his shield would require, how long his sword maintained its effectiveness before needing replacement. This predictability allowed for tactical innovations that depended on precise timing and coordination, such as the famous Spartan ability to execute complex formation changes while maintaining frontline pressure against enemy forces. The weapons themselves became symbols of collective identity, reinforcing the agoge training that had taught these men to view themselves primarily as components of a larger military machine, rather than as individual combatants. What made Spartan weapon production unique was the complete absence of commercial considerations that might have compromised military effectiveness. Unlike Athenian armorers who produced equipment for export throughout the Mediterranean world, Spartan workshops focused exclusively on meeting the needs of their own citizen soldiers. This specialization allowed for extreme refinement of military specifications, since there was no need to compromise between military requirements and market preferences. The result was weapons that represented the absolute optimum balance between effectiveness and practicality for the specific style of warfare that Spartans had perfected over centuries of development. Other Greek warriors might carry more decorative swords or longer spears that demonstrated individual wealth or personal preference. But Spartan equipment represented the ultimate expression of form, following function in the service of military efficiency. As you consider the Spartan approach to weapon production, you might find yourself marveling at the systematic thinking that characterized their entire approach to warfare. While other Greek city-states relied on individual wealth or family resources to equip their forces, Sparta had created an integrated system that connected battlefield experience, manufacturing capacity, and tactical doctrine in ways that maximize the effectiveness of their relatively small population of citizens. The rhythm of steel production in Spartan workshops represented not just technical expertise, but social organization. The ability to subordinate every aspect of individual and collective behavior to the requirements of military effectiveness. Yet this very standardization that made Spartans so formidable in conventional hoplite warfare also created vulnerabilities. When they faced enemies who employed different tactical systems, or who could afford to lose battles in ways that Spartans, with their small population of citizens, could not. The perfect weapons produced in Spartan workshops were designed for a style of warfare that would eventually become obsolete, leaving their makers prepared for conflicts that belonged to the past rather than the future. The Spartan military machine that had seemed invincible for generations began to show signs of strain, not through dramatic defeats or sudden collapses, but through the gradual accumulation of small inefficiencies that multiplied into systemic problems. The bronze equipment that had been perfected through centuries of refinement began to reveal its limitations when confronted with enemies who no longer fought according to the traditional rules of hoplite warfare. The very standardization that had made Spartan weapons so effective within their tactical system became a liability when facing opponents who employed different equipment, different tactics, and, most dangerously, different assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. The march of time brought changes that the Spartan system, optimized for a particular style of combat, found increasingly difficult to address. The first signs of trouble appeared in minor engagements where Spartan forces faced enemies who refused to engage in the conventional phalanx battles that had defined Greek warfare for centuries. These opponents employed hit-and-run tactics, used terrain to neutralize the advantages of heavy armor, or simply declined battle when the conditions favored traditional hoplite tactics. The Spartan warrior, equipped with his 70 pounds of bronze and iron, found himself pursuing lightly armed enemies who could move faster, strike from unexpected directions, and disengage before the phalanx could bring its concentrated power to bear. The perfect weapons that had been forged for formation fighting became burdens when flexibility and rapid movement were required, while the tactical doctrines that had been refined over generations provided no guidance for these new forms of combat, the economic foundation that supported. Spartan military equipment also began to show cracks as the helot population that worked the farms, providing resources for weapons production, became increasingly difficult to control. The cryptire system that had maintained helot subjugation through selective terror required a delicate balance. The Spartan state had to project enough power to discourage rebellion while avoiding policies so harsh that they provoked the very uprisings they were designed to prevent. As the helot population grew and their awareness of their collective power increased, maintaining this balance required ever greater investments of Spartan military resources, creating a feedback loop where the very success of helot suppression required resources that might otherwise have funded military modernization or diplomatic initiatives. The bronze equipment itself, which had represented the pinnacle of military technology for so long, began to seem increasingly obsolete when compared to innovations appearing elsewhere in the Greek world. Other city-states began experimenting with different armor materials, lighter weapons designs, and tactical formations that emphasized mobility over the static power of the traditional phalanx. The Spartan commitment to their perfected equipment prevented them from adopting these innovations, partly due to the enormous investment in their existing armament infrastructure, but more significantly because their entire social system was built around the assumption that hoplite warfare would remain unchanged. The Agog training system, the Sycytiadining groups, even the basic structure of Spartan citizenship all assumed that future battles would resemble past conflicts, making adaptation to new forms of warfare psychologically and socially difficult. The most dangerous development was not any single tactical innovation or economic challenge, but the gradual realization among Sparta's enemies that the Spartan military system had specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The heavy bronze equipment that made Spartans so formidable in direct confrontation also made them dependent on supply lines that could be disrupted. The small number of full Spartan citizens meant that losses in battle could not be easily replaced, making the state increasingly risk-averse as its citizen population declined. The social system that produced such effective warriors also created political rigidity that prevented adaptation to changing circumstances, as any significant reform would have threatened the carefully balanced relationships between citizens, perioikoi, and helots that sustained Spartan society. The final limitation revealed itself in the psychological realm, where the very training that had created such formidable warriors also made them less adaptable to changing conditions. The Agogi system had been designed to eliminate individual initiative in favor of collective obedience, producing soldiers who were unsurpassed at following orders and maintaining formation under extreme pressure. However, this same training made them less effective when situations required improvisation, individual decision-making, or adaptation to unexpected circumstances. As warfare became increasingly complex and less predictable, the Spartan strength of disciplined obedience became a weakness when flexibility and innovation were required. As you consider the decline of the Spartan military system, you might find yourself reflecting on the broader implications of optimization versus adaptation. The Spartans had created perhaps the most perfectly optimized military machine in ancient history, one that represented the absolute pinnacle of effectiveness within its chosen domain. Yet this perfection came at the cost of adaptability, creating a system so specialized that it could not adjust to changing conditions without undermining the fundamental principles that made it successful. The bronze equipment that had seemed so impressive in its heyday became a symbol of this larger problem. The weapons were not inadequate, but they were designed for a style of warfare that was gradually disappearing. The Spartan achievement was remarkable, but it was also finite, bound by the very excellence that had made it possible. As sleep approaches, you might consider whether human systems that pursue optimization to the exclusion of adaptation are doomed to eventual obsolescence, or whether there are lessons in the Spartan experience that apply beyond the specific context of ancient warfare. In the pre-dawn darkness that preceded every Spartan morning, while the citizen warriors prepared for their daily training, and the black broth simmered in the communal mess halls, another population moved through the valley with the practiced stealth of people who had learned that visibility could be dangerous. These were the helots, the subjugated peoples who formed the economic foundation of Spartan society while remaining officially invisible in its political and social structures. You would not see them in the Agog's training grounds or the Syssitia dining halls, but their labor made these institutions possible. Their agricultural production supported the warrior class, and their numbers outnumbered the Spartan citizens by ratios that varied between 7-1 and 10-1, depending on the historical period. The Valley of Shadows they inhabited was both literal and metaphorical, a space of economic necessity and political insignificance that defined their existence, in ways that modern concepts of slavery or serfdom cannot fully capture. The Helot population originated from two primary sources: the original inhabitants of Laconia who had been subjugated during the early expansion of Spartan power, and the much larger group from Messenia who were conquered during the brutal wars of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Unlike chattel slaves in other Greek city-states, who could be bought, sold, or freed according to market conditions, Helots were bound to specific plots of land that they worked for the benefit of assigned Spartan citizens. This arrangement created a form of hereditary serfdom in which Helot families maintained enough stability to reproduce their population over generations, but possessed no political rights, no freedom of movement, and no protection from the arbitrary violence that the Spartan state periodically employed to maintain control. The term Helot itself became so synonymous with servitude that it entered the Greek language as a general term for servile populations throughout the ancient world. The daily life of a Helot family bore no resemblance to the structured routine of Spartan citizens. While the warriors spent their days in military training and communal dining, Helots rose before dawn to work plots of land that they could never own, cultivating crops that they could never fully consume, and producing surplus that supported the Spartan military system. The agricultural calendar governed their existence in ways that were both familiar and oppressive: planting in the autumn, tending through the winter months, and harvesting in the spring and early summer, with each season bringing its own particular forms of physical exhaustion. The Helot farmer learned to judge the quality of soil, the timing of rains, and the optimal moments for planting and harvesting, developing agricultural expertise that was essential for Spartan prosperity but earned him no recognition or reward beyond the continuation of his servitude. The psychological impact of Helot status extended far beyond the physical demands of agricultural labor. Helots lived with the constant awareness that their continued existence depended entirely on Spartan sufferance, that any sign of resistance or insufficient productivity could result in immediate death for themselves and their families. This knowledge created a form of internalized oppression in which Helots learned to police their own behavior, to avoid any actions that might attract negative attention from their Spartan overseers, and to maintain the appearance of cheerful compliance even while harboring natural human resentment at their degraded status. The children of Helots learned these lessons from birth, absorbing through observation and direct instruction the behaviors necessary for survival under Spartan domination, including the ability to mask their true feelings and intentions behind expressions of willing servitude. The Spartan state maintained Helot subjugation through a combination of systematic violence and calculated manipulation that represented one of the most sophisticated systems of social control in the ancient world. The Cryptia, the secret police force composed of young Spartan warriors, conducted regular night raids designed not simply to eliminate potentially dangerous Helots, but to terrorize the entire population through selective violence. These operations targeted Helots who displayed unusual intelligence, physical prowess, or leadership qualities that might inspire resistance. But the selection process was deliberately unpredictable, ensuring that every Helot family lived with the knowledge that they might be next. The arbitrary nature of this violence served a specific psychological purpose: It made resistance seem futile by demonstrating that Spartan power could reach any helot at any time, regardless of their behavior or apparent loyalty. The economic relationship between Spartans and helots was structured to maximize agricultural productivity while minimizing the potential for organized resistance. Helot families were assigned to specific plots of land that they worked under the supervision of the Spartan citizen to whom that land had been allocated by the state. The helots retained a portion of their production for their own, subsistence a share that was calculated to keep them alive and productive, but not prosperous enough to accumulate resources that might support rebellion. The remainder was delivered to the Spartan citizen, who used it to fulfill his obligations to contribute to his Syssitia mess and to support his family. This system created a direct economic incentive for Spartans to maintain helot productivity while providing helots with just enough material stake in their work to discourage the kind of passive resistance that might have been tempting had they received nothing for their labor. The social dynamics within helot communities developed in response to their peculiar status as a permanently subjugated population. Helots created their own informal networks of communication and mutual support, developing systems for sharing information about Spartan activities, coordinating agricultural labor during busy seasons, and arranging marriages between families that might improve their collective security. These networks operated below the level of formal political organization, since any attempt to create helot institutions would have been immediately suppressed by Spartan authorities, but they provided helots with the social connections and practical support necessary for survival under oppressive conditions. The development of these networks represented a form of resistance that stopped short of open rebellion, but maintained the possibility of coordinated action should circumstances change to favor helot interests. The religious dimension of helot life presented particularly complex challenges, since helots were required to participate in Spartan religious festivals while maintaining their own traditional practices in private. The major Spartan festivals, which included processions, sacrifices, and communal meals, required helot participation as spectators, servants, or providers of agricultural produce for sacrificial offerings. Helots learned to perform these roles effectively while developing their own religious observances that were conducted secretly to avoid Spartan interference. These private religious practices served multiple functions. They maintained helot cultural identity distinct from Spartan domination, provided spiritual comfort under oppressive conditions, and created opportunities for gathering and communication that were not subject to direct Spartan supervision. The tension between public compliance and private identity became a defining characteristic of helot existence, requiring constant vigilance and emotional self-control. The demographic implications of helot status created long-term challenges that the Spartan state never fully resolved. Because helots could not be sold or relocated to distant markets, their population grew naturally over time, while the population of Spartan citizens remained relatively stable or even declined due to the military casualties and the strict requirements for citizenship. This demographic imbalance meant that the ratio of helots to citizens gradually increased, requiring ever greater investments of Spartan military resources to maintain control. The state responded through periodic interventions in helot reproduction, including selective killings during cryptire operations and restrictions on helot marriage and family formation. But these measures could not fundamentally alter the demographic trends that gradually undermined the Spartan position. The helot population represented not just an economic resource but a potential military threat that grew stronger with each passing generation. As you consider the helot experience in the Valley of Shadows, you might find yourself reflecting on the complex relationship between oppression and resistance that characterized their existence. The helot system represented one of history's most successful examples of long-term subjugation, maintaining effective control over a much larger population for several centuries through a combination of systematic violence, economic manipulation, and psychological oppression. Yet this same system also created the conditions for its own eventual destruction, as the very success of helot reproduction gradually shifted the balance of power, while the rigid Spartan refusal to adapt their social system prevented them from addressing the long-term implications of demographic change. The helots lived in the shadow, not just of Spartan power, but of historical forces that their oppressors could neither fully control nor ultimately survive, creating a situation where both populations were trapped in a relationship that served neither group's long-term interests. Beneath the surface of the Spartan agricultural economy that provided the foundation for their military society, a more complex economic system operated through networks of exchange and cooperation that connected helot communities in ways their Spartan overseers never fully understood. This secret economy was not a form of resistance in the conventional sense, since it did not directly challenge Spartan authority or attempt to overthrow the existing system of control. Instead, it represented a parallel system of economic relationships that allowed helots to improve their material conditions, develop specialized skills, and create social connections that provided some insulation against the arbitrary power of their masters. The secret economy operated through barter, mutual labor exchange, and the gradual accumulation of small advantages that made helot life marginally more bearable while creating the foundation for community solidarity that would prove crucial in later historical developments. The agricultural specialization that developed within helot communities reflected both the practical requirements of farming different microclimates within Laconia and Messenia and the opportunities created by limited market access to Spartan settlements and perioikoi communities. Helot families living in the mountainous regions of Laconia developed expertise in raising goats and sheep, producing wool, cheese, and meat that could be traded with helots in the valley areas who specialized in grain production and vegetable cultivation. These exchanges occurred without official sanction or formal markets, relying instead on established relationships between families and the informal credit systems that developed when immediate barter was impossible. The specialization created by these trade relationships allowed helot communities to achieve modest levels of prosperity that exceeded the minimum subsistence intended by Spartan policy, while the interdependence created by trade networks fostered cooperation between different helot communities that might otherwise have remained isolated from each other. The development of craft specialization within helot communities represented another dimension of the secret economy that evolved despite Spartan restrictions on helot economic activity. While Spartans prohibited helots from owning workshops or engaging in commercial production, they could not entirely prevent the development of skilled crafts among people who needed to maintain their own tools and equipment. Helot metalworkers learned to repair agricultural implements. Helot leather workers produced sandals and simple clothing, and helot builders developed expertise in constructing and maintaining the farm buildings essential for agricultural productivity. These skills initially developed to serve helot needs, gradually created opportunities for informal exchange with Spartan citizens and perioikoi, who required services that official Spartan workshops could not provide efficiently. The helot craftsmen who could repair a damaged plow or resolve a sandal created value that could be exchanged for small advantages, better tools, extra food, or information about Spartan activities that might affect his family's security. The role of women within the helot secret economy proved particularly significant, since helot women enjoyed relative freedom of movement compared to their Spartan counterparts, whose activities were more closely supervised according to Spartan social conventions. Helot women developed networks of exchange that connected different agricultural communities, carrying information about crop conditions, market opportunities, and Spartan activities while engaging in the routine economic activities necessary for family survival. These networks became conduits not just for material goods, but for the transmission of knowledge about agricultural techniques, medical remedies, and social connections that enhanced helot capacity to cope with oppressive conditions. The informal authority exercised by Helot women within these networks created alternative power structures that operated parallel to the official Spartan system, providing Helot communities with leadership and coordination that did not depend on formal recognition from their masters. The accumulation of small advantages through the secret economy created gradual improvements in Helot living conditions that, while individually insignificant, collectively represented a substantial enhancement in material circumstances compared to the minimum subsistence intended by Spartan policy. Helot families who participated in trade networks developed specialized skills and maintained connections with other communities achieved modest levels of prosperity that allowed them to accumulate small amounts of surplus food, better tools, and improved housing. These material improvements were not sufficient to threaten Spartan control directly, but they created the economic foundation for community development that would prove important when opportunities for resistance emerged. The Helot who had access to better nutrition, adequate clothing, and reliable tools was better positioned to consider alternatives to passive submission than one who lived at the edge of survival. The information networks that developed through Helot economic relationships represented perhaps the most significant long-term development within the secret economy. The informal exchanges that connected different Helot communities created mechanisms for sharing information about Spartan activities, political developments, and potential opportunities for improving individual or collective circumstances. These networks operated through the routine interactions necessary for economic exchange. A Helot woman carrying eggs to trade for wool might also carry news about recent cryptire activities, while a Helot metalworker repairing tools might learn about changes in Spartan agricultural policy that would affect his community. The information sharing that developed through these networks created a form of collective intelligence that allowed Helot communities to respond more effectively to Spartan policies than would have been possible through isolated family units. The seasonal patterns of the secret economy reflected both the agricultural calendar that governed Helot life and the military calendar that structured Spartan activities. The periods of heaviest agricultural labor, planting in autumn and harvesting in spring and early summer, also provided opportunities for Helot gatherings that could not be easily supervised by Spartans who were occupied with their own military training. These gatherings facilitated exchanges of goods, information, and social connections that strengthened Helot community ties while creating opportunities for collective action should circumstances prove favorable. The perioikoi communities that served as trading partners for Helot economic activities also provided connections to broader economic networks that extended beyond Spartan territory, creating potential links to external sources of support that might prove valuable. If open conflict developed between Helots and their masters, the long-term demographic effects of the secret economy created gradual changes in Helot social structure that reflected both improved material conditions and enhanced community organization. Helot families who participated effectively in trade networks and developed useful, specialized skills achieved modest levels of prosperity that allowed them to support larger families, creating population growth that reinforced the demographic trends already established through natural increase. The social differentiation that emerged within Helot communities through economic success did not create class conflict in the conventional sense, since all Helots shared the same fundamental status as subjugated peoples, but it did create leadership opportunities for individuals who could manage trade relationships, organize collective labor, or provide specialized services valued by their communities. These leadership roles provided experience in organization and decision-making that would prove valuable when Helot communities needed to coordinate responses to changing political conditions. As you examine the development of the Helot secret economy, you might find yourself recognizing patterns that appear in many situations where oppressed populations develop parallel economic systems to cope with and gradually improve their circumstances under difficult conditions. The Helot experience demonstrates that even extremely restrictive systems of control cannot entirely prevent the development of informal economic relationships that serve human needs for mutual support, specialized exchange, and gradual improvement in material conditions. The secret economy did not represent a direct challenge to Spartan authority, but it created the social and economic foundations for community development that would eventually contribute to the possibility of effective resistance. Most significantly, it provided helots with experience in organization, leadership, and collective action that would prove crucial when historical circumstances created opportunities to challenge Spartan domination directly. The economic relationships that developed in the shadows of Spartan power represented not just survival mechanisms, but the building blocks for potential transformation of the entire system that held helots in subjugation. The helot experience of subjugation created psychological and social effects that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of agricultural labor and political oppression, developing into complex patterns of identity, memory, and aspiration that would influence Greek history long after the Spartan system itself had collapsed. The relationship between helots and their Spartan masters represented one of history's most extended examples of successful domination, maintaining effective control over a subject population for several centuries through a combination of systematic violence, economic manipulation, and psychological terrorism. Yet this same system also created the conditions for its own eventual transformation, as helots developed adaptive strategies for survival that gradually enhanced their capacity for collective action. While the demographic and economic foundations of Spartan power slowly eroded under the weight of its own internal contradictions. The memory of freedom that helots maintained represented both a source of psychological comfort under oppressive conditions and a potential foundation for political organization when circumstances permitted more active resistance. Unlike chattel slaves who might have been born into slavery or captured from distant cultures, many helot families preserved oral traditions about their ancestors' lives before Spartan conquest, maintaining cultural practices, religious observances, and historical narratives that distinguished their identity from that imposed by their masters. These memories were not simply nostalgic recollections of a lost past, but active elements of cultural resistance that allowed helots to maintain a sense of collective identity separate from their subjugated status. The ability to remember freedom, even through generations of oppression, provided helots with psychological resources that made endurance possible while keeping alive the possibility that their circumstances might eventually change. The development of helot political consciousness occurred gradually through the accumulation of small experiences that demonstrated both the arbitrary nature of Spartan power and the potential for collective resistance. Individual helots learned through direct experience that Spartan authority, while seemingly absolute, could be evaded or manipulated through careful planning and mutual cooperation. The secret economy that developed between helot communities provided practical demonstrations that collective action could achieve modest improvements in material conditions, while the information networks that connected different agricultural settlements created opportunities for sharing knowledge about Spartan weaknesses or inconsistencies in their control system. These experiences did not immediately create revolutionary consciousness, but they provided the experiential foundation for political thinking that could develop into resistance. When external conditions became favorable, the transformation of helot identity from passive submission to active resistance required specific historical circumstances that emerged gradually as the Spartan system itself began to show signs of strain. The demographic imbalance that developed between helots and citizens created a situation where Spartan control required ever greater investments of military resources, while the economic prosperity achieved by some helot communities through the secret economy provided the material foundation for more organized forms of collective action. The external political developments that affected Spartan power, particularly the rise of Thebes and the growing influence of other Greek city-states, created opportunities for helots to establish connections with potential allies who might support resistance to Spartan domination. The combination of internal development and external opportunity created the conditions for helot, political activity that had been impossible during earlier periods of Spartan strength. The Messenian helots, who had been conquered in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, represented a particularly important element in the development of resistance consciousness, since they preserved stronger memories of independent political organization and maintained cultural traditions that distinguished them from both their Spartan masters and the Laconian helots, who had been subjugated earlier. The Messenian identity became a focal point for helot resistance, providing a historical narrative that justified claims to political autonomy and cultural distinctiveness that could be mobilized when opportunities for resistance emerged. The development of Messenian political consciousness among helots represented not simply nostalgia for lost independence, but active political thinking that connected historical memory with contemporary possibilities for changing their circumstances. The practical challenges of organizing helot resistance reflected both the effectiveness of Spartan control mechanisms and the internal divisions that the Spartan system had deliberately fostered between different helot communities. The assignment of helot families to specific Spartan citizens created economic relationships that provided some helots with modest advantages through association with relatively benevolent masters, while the geographical separation of different agricultural settlements made coordination between communities difficult without Spartan detection. The success of helot resistance required overcoming these divisions while developing organizational structures that could function effectively under conditions of extreme surveillance and repression. The experience gained through participation in the secret economy provided helots with practical knowledge about organization, leadership, and collective decision-making that proved valuable in addressing these challenges when opportunities for more active resistance emerged. The relationship between helot resistance and broader developments in Greek political thought reflected the emergence of new concepts about freedom, citizenship, and political legitimacy that would eventually transform the entire Greek world. The helot experience of subjugation contributed to developing Greek understanding of what it meant to be free, providing a concrete example of the contrast between citizens who possessed political rights and subjects who were denied them. The eventual success of helot liberation movements, particularly the establishment of an independent Messenian state in the 4th century BCE, demonstrated that even the most effective systems of domination could be challenged successfully when historical conditions became favorable. The helot struggle for freedom became part of the larger Greek conversation about political legitimacy that would influence the development of democratic institutions and concepts of citizenship that remain relevant to contemporary political thought. The long-term consequences of helot resistance extended far beyond the immediate achievement of political autonomy for specific communities, contributing to the transformation of Greek concepts about the relationship between power and legitimacy that would influence political development throughout the Mediterranean world. The helot experience demonstrated that systems of domination, no matter how effectively designed, created contradictions that could eventually be exploited by subject populations who developed the organizational capacity to challenge their masters. The success of helot liberation movements provided inspiration for other oppressed peoples, while contributing to the decline of Spartan power that had seemed unassailable during its period of greatest strength. The echoes of freedom that began in the quiet resistance of helot communities would eventually contribute to broader transformations that made the entire Spartan system unsustainable, demonstrating that even the most successful systems of oppression contain within themselves the seeds of their own eventual destruction. As you consider the helot experience of seeking freedom from within the Valley of Shadows, you might find yourself reflecting on the complex relationship between oppression and resistance that characterizes human responses to subjugation throughout history. The helots demonstrated that even extremely restrictive systems of control cannot entirely eliminate human capacity for adaptation, organization, and gradual development of alternatives to forced submission. Their experience provides insight into how oppressed populations develop strategies for survival that can evolve into more active forms of resistance when historical circumstances create favorable conditions for challenging established power relationships. The eventual success of Heller liberation efforts owed as much to the patient development of community resources, economic relationships, and organizational capacity under oppressive conditions as to the eventual emergence of external allies who provided military support for open resistance. The echoes of freedom that began in the whispers of Helot communities would eventually reach across the centuries to influence concepts about political legitimacy, resistance to oppression, and the human capacity to challenge even the most seemingly permanent systems of domination. As sleep approaches, you might consider whether the Helot experience offers insights about the relationship between immediate survival and long-term transformation that remain relevant to contemporary struggles against injustice and oppression. In the early morning hours of what would become one of history's most famous last stands, the narrow pass at Thermopylae presented itself as both a strategic opportunity and a death trap. The Phocian wall that blocked the main path through the pass had been hastily repaired by the Greek defenders, but its crumbling stones offered only symbolic protection against the massive Persian army that even then was beginning to stir in the valley below. King Leonidas, the Spartan commander who would become immortalized through his death in this place, stood with his 300 picked warriors and examined the terrain with the professional eye of a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for exactly this moment. The pass was barely 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, with steep cliffs rising on one side and the Malian Gulf's waters lapping against rocks on the other, creating a natural choke point that transformed numerical disadvantage into tactical advantage through the simple mathematics of geometry and the physics of human bodies pressed together in combat. The Spartan warriors who accompanied Leonidas had been selected through a process that reflected both the practical requirements of the mission and the particular Spartan understanding of military honor. These were not simply the strongest or most skilled warriors from the available forces, but men who had demonstrated the specific qualities necessary for a delaying action that everyone understood would end in death. The selection criteria included not just military prowess, but age. Most of the chosen warriors were between 30 and 40 years old enough to have proven themselves in previous campaigns, but young enough to endure the physical demands of the coming battle. They had to have living sons to ensure their family lines would continue, since the Spartan state could not afford to lose entire households in a single engagement. Most significantly, they had to have demonstrated a particular form of courage that Spartans valued above all else: the ability to maintain discipline and continue fighting with absolute commitment. Even when death was certain, the journey to Thermopylae had taken the Spartan force northward through territory that was nominally friendly but potentially hostile if the Persian advance continued unchecked. The warriors traveled light, carrying only their standard hoplite equipment and minimal supplies, knowing that their mission required speed more than sustainability. Each man marched with his 30-pound shield, supported by the Argive grip system that distributed weight across the forearm. His 8-foot spear balanced against his shoulder and his short sword sheathed at his side. The bronze equipment that had been perfected in Spartan workshops represented the culmination of centuries of refinement, designed specifically for the close-quarters combat that would define the coming battle. The march itself served as final preparation, hardening their feet on rocky paths and confirming that every piece of equipment was properly maintained and fitted for the combat conditions they would face. The strategic calculation behind the Spartan deployment to Thermopylae reflected the particular Greek understanding of how to resist the Persian invasion effectively. The pass represented one of only a few practical routes for the massive Persian army to move southward into central Greece, making its defense essential for protecting the Greek heartland. The narrow confines would neutralize the Persian numerical advantage while maximizing the effectiveness of Greek heavy infantry, whose bronze armor and disciplined formations had been specifically designed for exactly this type of combat. The Greek strategy called for holding the pass long enough for the main Greek armies to mobilize and prepare for battle on more favorable terms elsewhere, meaning that Leonidas's mission was explicitly understood as a delaying action that would buy time through the sacrifice of his force. This knowledge shaped every aspect of the Spartan preparations, from the selection of warriors to the choice of defensive positions within the pass. The psychological preparation for certain death occurred through the ordinary routines of Spartan military life, which had been specifically designed to condition warriors to face exactly this situation. The Agog training system had eliminated the normal human responses to mortal danger through systematic exposure to extreme stress, teaching warriors to function effectively while suppressing the panic and paralysis that might prevent effective combat. The daily consumption of black broth in the Syssitia, the rough sleeping arrangements that eliminated dependence on comfort, and the constant physical training that pushed the body to its limits all served to create warriors who could continue fighting with absolute commitment, even while knowing that death was inevitable. The particular Spartan understanding of honor required that they maintain this commitment not for the possibility of survival, but because their identity as Spartans made any alternative unthinkable. The tactical deployment within the narrow pass required the Spartans to adapt their usual phalanx tactics to the specific constraints imposed by the terrain. Instead of the deep formations typically used in open field battles, they arranged themselves in a thin line that stretched across the entire width of the pass, with each warrior positioned to maximize his effectiveness in the confined space. The front rank would bear the initial impact of Persian attacks, but the narrow front meant that only a limited number of warriors could engage the enemy simultaneously, requiring constant rotation of personnel to maintain fighting effectiveness over what everyone expected would be several days of combat. This arrangement maximized the advantage of Greek bronze armor and heavy spears against the lighter equipment typically used by Persian infantry, while minimizing the exposure of individual warriors to being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The relationship between the Spartan contingent and the other Greek forces at Thermopylae reflected the complex political dynamics that characterized the Greek resistance to Persian invasion. The 300 Spartans were accompanied by several thousand warriors from other Greek city-states, creating a combined force that was still vastly outnumbered by the Persian army, but represented the first unified Greek response to the invasion. The command structure placed Leonidas in overall command as a recognition of Spartan military reputation, but the diverse origins of the troops required careful management of relationships between different military traditions and equipment standards. The Spartan warriors understood that their primary role was to provide an example of uncompromising resistance that would inspire the other Greeks to maintain their positions even when the situation seemed hopeless, making their conduct during the battle as important for its psychological impact on allies as for its tactical effectiveness against enemies. The communication systems that connected the defenders at Thermopylae with the broader Greek resistance effort reflected the understanding that this battle was part of a larger strategic campaign, rather than an isolated engagement. Runners carried messages to the main Greek forces assembling at Corinth. Naval commanders received updates about Persian fleet movements that might affect the land battle, and local Greek communities provided intelligence about Persian activities in the surrounding territory. The Spartan warriors understood that their sacrifice would resonate far beyond the narrow pass where they would make their stand, influencing Greek morale and Persian tactical calculations throughout the coming campaign. This knowledge transformed what might have seemed like a futile gesture into meaningful military action that served larger, strategic objectives, even though it would end in the deaths of everyone involved. As the first Persian scouts began probing the Greek positions, the Spartans settled into the routine that would define their final days alternating periods of combat with the maintenance activities necessary to preserve their fighting effectiveness. They sharpened their spear points, checked the straps on their shields, adjusted the fit of their bronze armor, and shared the simple meals of barley bread and cheese that would sustain them through the coming battle. The ordinary nature of these activities, performed with the same attention to detail that had characterized their entire military careers, demonstrated the particular Spartan genius for transforming extraordinary circumstances into manageable routine. The narrow way at Thermopylae had become not just a geographical feature, but a metaphor for the Spartan approach to life itself, finding strength through limitations, creating order within chaos, and discovering meaning through absolute commitment to duty regardless of personal cost. The first Persian assault against the Greek positions at Thermopylae began shortly after dawn on the second day of the battle, when Xerxes became impatient with the delays caused by the narrow pass and ordered his Median and Sicyan troops to clear the path through direct attack. The sight that greeted the Persian forces as they advanced up the pass must have seemed almost insulting in its simplicity, a thin line of heavily armored Greek warriors standing motionless behind their massive shields, with no apparent fortifications beyond the primitive wall that blocked the main route. The Persian commanders, accustomed to the elaborate siege techniques and complex tactical deployments that characterized their usual military operations, appeared to expect that superior numbers and individual warrior prowess would quickly overwhelm this seemingly inadequate defensive position. The result was a military education in the effectiveness of disciplined heavy infantry fighting in terrain that maximized their advantages while minimizing their vulnerabilities. The combat that followed demonstrated the particular effectiveness of Greek hoplite tactics when employed by warriors whose entire lives had been dedicated to perfecting exactly this form of warfare. The Spartan warriors held their position in the narrow pass with a steadiness that seemed to defy the normal human responses to mortal danger, maintaining their formation as the Persian forces crashed against their shield wall in wave after wave of increasingly desperate attacks. The 8-foot spears of the Greeks reached out over the massive hoplon shields to strike the lighter armored Persian infantry before they could bring their shorter weapons to bear, while the bronze armor of the hoplites turned aside most of the arrows and javelins that the Persian archers launched in attempts to break the Greek formation. The bodies of fallen Persian warriors accumulated in front of the Greek position, creating additional obstacles that further complicated the approach for subsequent waves of attackers. The particular style of combat that developed during the first day's fighting reflected both the tactical advantages enjoyed by the Greek defenders and the specific training that Spartan warriors had received throughout their military careers. Instead of individual duels or dramatic displays of personal heroism, the battle consisted of steady mechanical application of force through the coordinated movements of the entire phalanx formation. The warriors in the front rank would thrust their spears repeatedly over their shield rims, targeting the faces and torsos of approaching Persian soldiers, while those in the rear ranks provided physical pressure that prevented any retreat and psychological support that maintained morale under extreme stress. When front rank warriors became exhausted or their spears broke, they would rotate to the rear while fresh fighters took their places, maintaining continuous pressure against the enemy throughout the day's combat. The psychological impact of the first day's fighting extended far beyond its tactical significance, demonstrating to both Persians and Greeks that the Spartan reputation for military invincibility was based on more than mere propaganda or historical memory. The Persian army that had conquered much of the known world through a combination of numerical superiority, tactical flexibility, and superior logistics found itself unable to dislodge a force that was outnumbered by ratios that might have seemed comical in different circumstances. For the other Greek contingents fighting alongside the Spartans, the demonstration provided irrefutable evidence that Persian forces could be defeated by properly trained and motivated Greek heavy infantry, creating confidence that would prove crucial for the larger Greek resistance effort. The Spartan warriors themselves received confirmation that their decades of training and sacrifice had prepared them for exactly this type of combat, reinforcing their determination to maintain their position regardless of the cost. The medical and logistical challenges that emerged during the first days of fighting revealed the practical difficulties of maintaining combat effectiveness under siege conditions, while demonstrating the particular Spartan genius for transforming logistical problems into opportunities for maintaining morale. The warriors had brought only minimal supplies of food and water, expecting to be resupplied from local sources or to conduct the battle as a brief delaying action rather than an extended defense. The reality of Persian numerical superiority meant that the Greeks found themselves maintaining their positions for far longer than originally anticipated, requiring them to ration their limited supplies while dealing with wounded comrades who could not be evacuated to safety. The Spartan response to these challenges reflected their training in overcoming adversity through collective effort, with healthy warriors sharing their rations with the wounded. Medical care provided using the basic techniques available to hoplite forces, and constant rotation of personnel to prevent exhaustion from undermining combat effectiveness. The evolution of Persian tactics as the battle continued provided a practical education in the limitations of the Spartan military system and the particular vulnerabilities that became apparent when their preferred style of combat could not be employed effectively. After the initial frontal assaults failed to dislodge the Greek defenders, Persian commanders began experimenting with different approaches, including the use of their elite immortal units, attempts to scale the cliffs that flanked the pass, and efforts to employ archery more effectively against the heavily armored hoplites. While these tactical innovations failed to break the Greek position during the main battle, they demonstrated that Persian forces possessed the flexibility and tactical sophistication necessary to adapt to unfamiliar forms of combat, suggesting that future battles might not follow the same patterns that had characterized the first day's fighting. The Spartan warriors, trained exclusively for the close-quarters combat that favored their equipment and tactics, found themselves required to maintain their positions while facing enemies who were learning to exploit the limitations inherent in the hoplite system. The gradual revelation of Persian intentions through the actions of Ephialtes, the Greek traitor who revealed the mountain path that allowed Persian forces to outflank the Greek position, created the moral crisis that defined the final phase of the battle at Thermopylae. The discovery that their position had been compromised transformed the Greek mission from a delaying action that might have allowed for strategic withdrawal into a fight to the death that served primarily symbolic rather than tactical objectives. The Spartan warriors understood immediately that their options had been reduced to two alternatives. They could abandon their position and attempt to retreat, preserving their lives while accepting the loss of strategic advantage that their defense had provided, or they could maintain their position and die fighting, transforming their resistance into a permanent example of Greek determination to resist Persian domination. The decision to remain and fight to the death represented the ultimate expression of Spartan military values, demonstrating that their concept of honor required maintaining their position regardless of the tactical situation. The final morning at Thermopylae dawned with the knowledge that the Greek position had been compromised and that the battle would end with the deaths of all the defenders, transforming what had begun as tactical military operation into a permanent example of courage and sacrifice that would influence Greek culture for centuries. The night before the final assault, Leonidas had dismissed the non-Spartan Greek contingents, recognizing that their death alongside his warriors would serve no strategic purpose, while their survival might contribute to the larger Greek resistance effort. This decision reflected the particular Spartan understanding that individual sacrifice gained meaning through its contribution to collective objectives, demonstrating that even in the face of certain death, tactical decisions should be evaluated according to their strategic consequences rather than their emotional appeal. The warriors who remained with Leonidas understood that their deaths would serve as a rallying point for Greek resistance, transforming their personal sacrifice into a permanent argument against submission to Persian rule. The final combat itself represented the ultimate expression of hoplite warfare conducted under conditions that maximized every advantage of the Greek system while minimizing the effectiveness of Persian numerical superiority. With their position secure from outflanking maneuvers by the natural barriers of cliff and sea, the remaining Greeks formed their phalanx across the entire width of the pass, creating an immovable obstacle that required the Persians to attack them head-on through terrain that prevented the deployment of overwhelming numbers. The Spartan warriors fought with the absolute commitment that their training had prepared them for, maintaining their formation even as their numbers diminished through attrition, rotating positions to bring fresh fighters to the front, and continuing to inflict casualties on attacking Persian forces at rates that seemed impossible given the disparity in numbers between attackers and defenders. The battle became not simply a military engagement, but a demonstration of what highly trained heavy infantry could achieve when, motivated by absolute determination to maintain their position regardless of personal cost. The specific circumstances of Leonidas's death became the focus of countless retellings that emphasized his personal courage while transforming the entire battle into a narrative about the superiority of Greek values over Persian despotism. According to contemporary accounts, Leonidas died while fighting at the front of the phalanx, having personally engaged the enemy commanders who led the final assault against the Greek position. His death did not trigger the collapse of Greek resistance, but rather intensified it, as the remaining warriors fought with even greater determination to protect his body and to demonstrate that Spartan courage did not depend on the presence of any single leader. The recovery of Leonidas's body by the Persians, followed by its return to the Greeks under a truce arranged after the battle, created an opportunity for the elaborate funeral ceremonies that transformed his death from a military defeat into a permanent monument to Greek resistance against foreign domination. The immediate aftermath of the battle demonstrated the strategic wisdom of the Greek decision to maintain their position even when retreat became possible, as the example of Spartan sacrifice provided crucial motivation for the broader Greek resistance effort that would ultimately defeat the Persian invasion. The news of Thermopylae spread throughout the Greek world with remarkable speed, transforming what had been a tactical victory for the Persians into a strategic defeat through its impact on Greek morale and Persian confidence. The Persian army that had seemed invincible during its advance through northern Greece found itself facing Greek forces whose determination had been strengthened by the example of Spartan sacrifice, while the Greek city-states that had considered submitting to Persian rule discovered new resolve to maintain their independence. The battle became a permanent argument in Greek political discourse about the relationship between freedom and citizenship, demonstrating that the privileges of Greek citizenship required the willingness to defend them with absolute commitment. The long-term cultural impact of Thermopylae extended far beyond its immediate military or political consequences, creating a permanent example in Greek culture of the values that distinguished free citizens from subjects of despotic power. The story of Leonidas and his 300 warriors became a standard element in Greek education, providing young citizens with a concrete example of the courage and sacrifice that their own citizenship might someday require. The particular Spartan emphasis on collective achievement over individual glory, on discipline over personal heroism, and on duty over self-preservation created a template for military virtue that influenced Greek concepts of citizenship for centuries. The battle demonstrated that the advantages of Greek political freedom were not simply theoretical, but required concrete willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective independence, creating a standard against which later claims about political obligation could be measured and evaluated. The physical site of Thermopylae itself became a permanent monument to the events that had occurred there, with the erection of memorials that transformed the narrow pass into a place of pilgrimage for Greeks who wanted to connect with the example of courage that the battle had provided. The most famous of these memorials, the epitaph composed by Simonides that declared, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie," encapsulated the particular Spartan understanding that individual glory derived from obedience to collective values rather than from personal achievement or recognition. The transformation of the battle site into a permanent monument demonstrated the Greek understanding that certain events gained meaning through their commemoration, creating physical reminders that could inspire future generations to maintain the values that the original participants had demonstrated through their sacrifice. The eternal example established by Thermopylae continues to influence discussions about the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective values, demonstrating that certain forms of political action gain their significance through their willingness to accept personal loss for the sake of larger principles. The Spartan warriors who died in the narrow pass had not simply been defeated in battle, but had transformed their deaths into a permanent argument about the nature of citizenship, freedom, and political obligation that remained relevant long after the specific historical circumstances that created the battle had disappeared. Their example suggests that human communities require stories about sacrifice and commitment to maintain their understanding of what their collective values demand from individual. The ripples created by the Spartan last stand at Thermopylae spread across Greek civilization like waves from a stone dropped in still water, transforming not just how Greeks understood military courage, but how they conceived the fundamental relationship between individual citizens and their political communities. The news of Leonidas's sacrifice traveled through the Greek world with remarkable speed, carried by merchants, travelers, and official messengers whose stories grew more vivid with each retelling until the events at the narrow pass assumed mythic proportions that transcended their tactical significance. Within weeks of the battle, Greek communities that had been considering accommodation with Persian power found themselves facing crowds of citizens who demanded resistance modeled on the Spartan example. While the Persian commanders who had achieved tactical victory discovered that their success had come at the price of strategic credibility throughout the territories they sought to control. The transformation of Thermopylae from military defeat to cultural victory demonstrated the Greek understanding that certain forms of political action gain their significance through their willingness to accept loss for the sake of larger principles rather than through their immediate practical consequences. The Persian army that advanced southward after defeating the Greek defenders found itself facing opponents whose determination had been strengthened by the example of Spartan sacrifice, while the Greek city-states that had remained neutral or considered submission discovered new resolve to maintain their independence. The battle became a standard reference in Greek political discourse, invoked by politicians and orators who sought to demonstrate the relationship between citizenship and obligation, between the privileges of political freedom and the willingness to defend those privileges with absolute commitment regardless of personal cost. The memorialization of Thermopylae created permanent physical reminders of the events that had occurred there, transforming the narrow pass into a place of pilgrimage that connected subsequent generations with the example of courage that the battle had provided. The most enduring of these memorials, the stone lion erected to commemorate Leonidas and his fallen warriors, stood as a local landmark that anchored the story in physical reality while creating a site for commemoration that would influence Greek understanding of how historical memory should be preserved and transmitted. The epitaph composed by Simonides that declared obedience to Spartan laws as the reason for the warriors' presence at Thermopylae established a particular interpretation of the events that emphasized collective values over individual heroism, creating a template for understanding military virtue that emphasized duty to community rather than personal glory or achievement. The cultural impact of Thermopylae extended into Greek education, where the story of Leonidas and his warriors became a standard element in the formation of young citizens who might someday face similar choices between personal safety and collective obligation. The particular Spartan emphasis on discipline over individual accomplishment, on maintaining formation under extreme pressure, and on continuing to fight even when survival seemed impossible, created a model for military virtue that influenced military training throughout the Greek world. The battle demonstrated that the advantages of Greek political freedom required concrete willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective independence, establishing a standard against which later claims about political obligation could be measured and evaluated by citizens who understood that their privileges came with corresponding responsibilities. The philosophical implications of Thermopylae influenced Greek thinking about the nature of courage, the meaning of political obligation, and the relationship between individual identity and collective community that would shape political theory for centuries. The Spartan willingness to die rather than abandon their position provided concrete evidence for philosophical discussions about whether courage required the willingness to face death or merely the ability to overcome fear while pursuing chosen objectives. The battle became a reference point for arguments about whether political communities could demand absolute sacrifice from their members, and under what circumstances such demands represented legitimate exercises of political authority, rather than abuse of state power over individual citizens. Long-term military consequences of Thermopylae influenced Greek tactical development by demonstrating the effectiveness of heavy infantry deployed in defensive positions, while also revealing the limitations of purely defensive strategies when facing enemies who possessed superior resources and tactical flexibility. The battle encouraged other Greek city-states to invest in hoplite equipment and training, contributing to the standardization of Greek military practice around the phalanx system that would dominate warfare for centuries. However, the battle also revealed that tactical success in specific engagements could not substitute for strategic resources and diplomatic coordination necessary for long-term victory in extended conflicts, lessons that would prove crucial for the eventual Greek victory in the Persian Wars. The historical memory of Thermopylae created expectations about Spartan military capabilities that would influence Greek politics for generations, establishing the Spartans as the ultimate military specialists whose participation in any conflict guaranteed maximum commitment and effectiveness. This reputation provided Sparta with diplomatic influence that exceeded its demographic resources, allowing the small city-state to play leading roles in Greek affairs long after its military peak had passed. The memory of Thermopylae also created obligations for future Spartan generations to maintain the standards established by their predecessors, contributing to the political and social rigidity that would eventually prevent Sparta from adapting to changing historical circumstances. When their traditional military system became obsolete, the eternal example established by Thermopylae continues to influence discussions about the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective values, demonstrating that certain forms of political action gain their significance through their willingness to accept personal loss for the sake of larger principles that transcend immediate tactical considerations. The Spartan warriors who died in the narrow pass had not simply been defeated in battle, but had transformed their deaths into a permanent argument about the nature of citizenship, freedom, and political obligation that remained relevant long after the specific historical circumstances that created the battle had disappeared. Their example suggests that human communities require stories about sacrifice and commitment to maintain their understanding of what their collective values demand from individual members, creating standards that inspire future actions while providing frameworks for evaluating moral obligations within political communities. As you consider the complete story of the Spartan warriors from their austere morning routines with black broth to their final stand at Thermopylae, you might find yourself reflecting on the complex relationship between individual transformation and collective identity that characterized their entire civilization. The Spartans created perhaps the most successful example of systematic human transformation in ancient history, taking ordinary children and shaping them into warriors whose discipline, courage, and loyalty became legendary throughout the known world. Yet, this achievement came at an enormous cost: the elimination of most of what we consider essential to human fulfillment: personal choice, emotional expression, family intimacy, intellectual curiosity, and creative expression. The Spartan experience demonstrates both the incredible potential of human communities to shape their members according to shared values and the ultimate price of pursuing optimization at the expense of adaptation, creating a system so specialized that it could not survive the changes that time inevitably brings to even the most successful civilizations.